The invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan were not exceptions. How many countries has the US invaded? Welcome to the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. The invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan are fresh in our memories. After that, maybe Somalia, Kosovo, or Haiti come to mind. But the list doesn't end. Invasions and overthrows are common in our history, more common than you probably think. Joining me now is Kinzer, an award-winning foreign correspondent who has spent decades seeing U.S. foreign interventions up close in places like Nicaragua, Germany, and Istanbul for the New York Times. His book, Overthrow: America's Century of Regime Change from Hawaii to Iraq, details U.S. interventions over the last 100 years. Welcome to the program, Stephen.
Good to be with you.
So when did the U.S. begin in its involvement promoting regime change? When did the U.S. start promoting regime change historically? And was the Cold War a sort of turning point in that history?
In essence, we've had three stages of our expansionism. First, we became a continental empire. And then, beginning around 1898, we transformed ourselves into an overseas empire. And then, in the period after World War II, we became a global empire. So in this sense, you can imagine it as a process that began early and continued right through our history.
How does our government keep from its people the truth of these bloody interventions that we've had over the years, over the founding of this country, all the way through to today? I mean, certainly there have been times in our history, such as when the Iraq War was at its worst, when the war became very unpopular. But by and large, Americans don't seem to see the reality of what we are doing in countries abroad.
When American leaders order and promote interventions in foreign countries, they're not doing it strictly in a vacuum. We have a consensus in this country that this is a good thing to do. The press promotes it. Both political parties are competing against each other to be great cheerleaders for foreign intervention. There's great economic pressure from the defense industry and others that rely on it. So it's a collaborative process. It's a mistake to say that there's a clique in Washington that has hijacked America. Actually, we're all complicit in this. We have this idea that the world is in a big mess because other countries don't act the way the United States does. We imagine that there's some template that we can impose on the world that will make everything better. And whenever they want to intervene anywhere, for whatever reason, they like to cloak their interventions in some kind of a nice-sounding rhetoric. We have gone from the policy of liberation, as we called it during the 1950s, onto democracy promotion. That might not be the real reason we're intervening, but Americans are very susceptible because of a combination of naivete and true idealism to such rhetoric, and I think that our leaders use it very effectively to promote their own interventions.
And yet we have supported and worked with so many undemocratic regimes over the years when it has suited us. So this rhetoric of democracy promotion is useful in some cases when it aligns with our interests, but we openly side with very undemocratic regimes, such as Saudi Arabia, to just throw out one example, when it suits us to do so, right?
We have our own definition of freedom. The definition we've evolved is that when a country is open to American strategic power and when it allows American business the freedom to operate as it wishes in a foreign country, then that's a country that has true liberty. That's a way you can say that, for example, Iran under the Shah was freer than it was under the elected government of Mossadegh, or Chile was more free under the Pinochet dictatorship than it was under the elected Allende government. It's true if you want to say that freedom means the freedom of American corporations to operate. So as long as we redefine freedom the way we wish, we can tell ourselves that freedom is the true goal and result of our interventions.
So that's why, for example, a country like Venezuela is seen as undemocratic, even though its citizens are very engaged engaged in the government, but its economy is close to the United States or is nationalized, and that's something the U.S. doesn't like.
And I'd add another point to that. Venezuela is its own country. Venezuela is the product of a whole series of situations, like every country is. Venezuela's dealing with Venezuelan problems. Perhaps the Venezuelans are making wise decisions. Perhaps they're making foolish decisions. That's for Venezuelans to decide. It's not up to the United States to sit in front of a map of the world and decide which countries are going right and which countries are going wrong and deserve American intervention.
I'm wondering if you can explain for us how, over the U.S. history, it almost hasn't mattered who has been in the White House when it has come to foreign policy. We've had a fairly uniform trajectory of intervening in other countries' affairs, even if the language that we use to justify it may differ slightly from president to president. How much leeway does the commander-in-chief really have over U.S. foreign policy?
Every time I go to Washington, which is as rarely as possible, I'm impressed with how narrow is the spectrum of acceptable opinions in foreign policy. In order to participate productively in the foreign policy discussion in Washington, you have to accept 100 fundamental precepts and principles that shaped and continue to shape our foreign policy. Once you begin to dissent in any significant way, you fall into this syndrome of, as they say in Hollywood, you'll never eat lunch in this town again. There's a great desire to maintain this consensus in foreign policy, and any suggestion that we should step outside the generalized rules that have shaped the way we interact with the world over recent generations is treated as the germ of a frightful plague that has to be eradicated before it infects the entire policy process.
Given that today we have the ability to shine a greater light on these issues, we're living in an age where communication is so much faster, and more people see themselves as citizen journalists. Do you feel that there is hope for reform of U.S. foreign policy? Will there be a time when the U.S. won't be so invested in intervening in other countries' affairs?
I certainly would like to think there is hope for a change in the direction of American foreign policy. I do ask myself this question, however. The United States now seems to be, as a nation, a little bit more reluctant to intervene in the affairs of other countries. That's a reasonable result of our recent history. We've gotten two big punches in the face from Afghanistan and Iraq, and after losing two such important wars so decisively, I do think Americans are a little bit taken aback and not so willing to pursue this policy anymore. Nonetheless, I ask myself, is this a permanent change of attitude, or does it just mean that we've taken a few punches and when we get a little bit of smelling salt, so we're going to be back in the ring and return to what has been essentially a long-term policy that's lasted more than 100 years in our history? The verdict is still out, and I hope ordinary Americans, through what remains of our political democracy, will be able to influence the future course of our interventions and try to take a more prudent and conservative approach rather than taking the utopian view that the world is in big trouble and we know better what is good for the world than the world itself knows.
Well, Stephen Kinzer, thank you so much for joining us.
It's been great to be here. Thanks.
On the next episode of the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum, we're joined by author John Tierman to talk about the fate of civilians in the countries we attack.
The U.S. has never really implemented counterinsurgency successfully. If you're bombing, if you have these long-range artillery, if you have other operations that produce casualties, it's going to be very hard to convince the population that you're looking out for their best interests. So we have yet to see if counterinsurgency really works.